Greetings and welcome back to room 303 of the Harvard Classic Lectures. This is Harvard Classic Lecture number 45, Emerson's The Poet, from the Harvard Classics Lectures, volume number 5. It's interesting to me that as I talk with people over the years about the essays of Emerson, that artists and poets, not surprisingly, find this one of those essays that's the most compelling for them. Maybe we'll talk at length at the end of this lecture about why that might be the case. And if you're an individual who, considers yourself potentially an artist, this essay may resonate for you in a profound way. Now, just for some background information and some introductory comments, as we always do in our lectures, if you haven't been following my other lectures, then hit learnstrong.net, go down that left-hand side, find the Harvard Classics folder, and at least watch Lecture 35, which is my introductory to Emerson. Again, we're commenting on Emerson from at least 3 different perspectives. For sure, we want to talk about him as teacher and as person, his history, and that kind of thing. We want to see him, number 2, as a philosopher, an idealist, sometimes referred to as a transcendentalist, although he himself didn't always like that term so much. And then finally, and this is significant for this lecture and this essay, Emerson as artist, Emerson as creator, that to-be stuff as we talk about it when we talk about our levels of reading. Just to remind, learning theory, we are always trying to connect new information to old information. We're always trying to ask, how does this kind of information have any resonance or meaning for me? And our 3 levels of reading are also significant. At level 1, we're asking, what does the text say? Summarizing. At level 2, what does the text mean? We divide. What does the text mean in regards to themes, messages? And then finally, that notion at 2B that we just mentioned, that rhetoric stuff. Not what Emerson says, but how Emerson says it. I won't get to read all of this essay, and that frustrates me because of the essays that I've studied with you so far. I would love to just read this in its entirety to you because the essay actually begins to read like a poem. It's quite amazing prose. And then finally, at level 3, we're asking, how do I relate to this information? At 3A, how do I relate to this to other texts that I know? And then finally, how do I relate it to me personally? Some background information quickly. Published in 1844. Think of it. 11 years later, Whitman's Leaves of Grass in 1855 will be produced, and we'll have more lectures on this coming. Whitman doesn't end up in the Harvard Classics, but I am going to give some lectures on Leaves of Grass just because I think it's important for you guys to have that information as well. But certainly we're going to see this as the beginnings, the genesis in many ways of the project that we will call the greatest American poet in Walt Whitman. Now let's remind, Emerson was acutely aware that the Greeks had an understanding, as we've said in other lectures, of the importance of the poet, what we might today call the artist, but for sure the poet, where you have the gods at the top, because epistemologically and ontologically, they of course have things that humans don't have. They know everything, and of course they don't die, they're immortal, right? And then there's humans, which are of course almost antithetical, that is to say we are mortal and we know virtually nothing. In between are the poets, and the poets are, for the Greeks, inspired. That is to say, the muses give the poets information, which then the poets will translate on to humans so that humans can survive this wretched thing called a life. Now that's the Greek idea of the artist and the poet, and Emerson is very much going to play the same game. But I want to start, because I know Emerson and it's there in his mind, even though he didn't say it because he loved his Homer. I want to start with that story. You'll remember it. It's a wonderful one, where at the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus standing there in blood and guts. He's jacked all those guys, and all of a sudden there's 2 guys who have been hiding brought in front of him, and they're thrown down. He asks the first guy, what do you do? And the guy says, I'm a priest, and cuts off his head. Maybe he didn't like going to church or something, I don't know. He asks the second guy, what do you do? And he goes, I'm a poet, and Odysseus leaves him alive to tell the story. Now, I think that tension between poets versus priests is going to be central as well to this. We will often think of it as the tension as well between science and art. And like Keats and Shelley, you'll remember our comments on defense of poetry, right? For Emerson, poets are the greatest people. Now, I like to point this out. I mean, just recently, the great Stephen Hawkins passed and had a funeral, March the 31st, 2018. And that amazing science mind, when people came together to celebrate his life, what was read to celebrate his life? Interestingly, no books of science. Rather, some poetry from the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, we've pointed this out in other lectures, that this is exactly the argument that Shelley makes as well in defense of poetry. Here's how you know that poets are the vital part of a culture. The deaths of us all seem to be attended not by treatises on calculus or engineering ideas, but rather poetry. Of course, the argument is nobody really believes in poetry today. If you don't believe this, just go home and say to your folks, hey, listen, I've decided I know what I'm going to major in college. Instead of being an engineer or pre-med or pre-law, I'm going to go ahead and just major in poetry. You'll have the same response Dante's father probably had for Dante when he told him, nobody will ever know your name if you're a poet instead of a lawyer. The joke, of course, is on the father in that one. Let's turn now to Emerson's idea and the importance of poets and artists, and we'll ask if any of what he has to say resonates with us today, right? Of course, we'll have as well behind us this question: who are the poets or the artists of today that are most important, right? I mean, are they today more like celebrities, like movie stars or musicians? I mean, we can think about really important movie stars. The great Daniel Day-Lewis, Meryl Streep come to mind. We can think, of course, about people like Steven Spielberg who make these amazing films. Are they the kind of new poets of our time and of our age? We'll have to ask these questions. Okay, let's take a look now at all 37 of these paragraphs. Again, I recommend that you would record in your copy so that you're able to reference with me. And at level 1 now, I'm just going to work through each one of these paragraphs quickly. Again, I wish that I could read it all, but I can't. Let's do a brief outline, though, just so you know the ground, the territory. In part 1, roughly the first 8, 9, 10 paragraphs, we're going to hear about the poet as interpreter and visionary. In part 2, roughly paragraphs 10 to 18 or so, we're going to hear about relationships between the poet and language and nature. In part 3, roughly paragraphs 19 through 29, 30, we're going to hear about the poet as liberator of humanity. And then finally in part 4, that is to say from paragraph roughly 30 to the end, we're going to hear about the call for a new poet, and it will be there that many scholars believe that Whitman said, I will be the poet. And he became, as we've said in other lectures already on Whitman, he became America's poet. Okay, let's begin in paragraph number 1. He begins by slamming the critics, which is of course an ironic way to begin. He sees the critics as shallow. He says that the intellectual makes no difference between the material world and the world of ideas. The theologian, he says, relies primarily on historical evidence. But he says the poet is an interdependence between, a relational understanding between those two boxes that we listed in an earlier lecture, where in the first box we're playing with the world of form, and in the second box we're playing with the world of formless. In other words, in the first box we will write down a beautiful body, because of course everything in the first box you can see, taste, touch, etc. But in that second box, we are talking not about a beautiful body, but rather the concept beauty itself, right? So the poet is the one who understands the power of both boxes. Maybe another way to say this is, he uses the first box to explain the second box or to understand it. We are children of fire, he says, as he gets into this discussion. And then I'll do my first reading. And this hidden truth, he says, that the fountains whence all this river of time and its creatures floweth are intrinsically ideal and beautiful, draws us to the consideration of the nature and functions of the poet or the man of beauty, to the means and materials he uses, and to the general aspect of the art in the present time. In paragraph number 2, he makes the observation that the breadth of the problem is great, for the poet is representative. He stands among partial men for the complete man, and apprises us not of his wealth, but of his commonwealth. The young man reveres men of genius because, to speak truly, they are more himself than he is. They receive of the soul as he also receives, but they more. Nature enhances her beauty to the eye of loving men from their belief that the poet is beholding her shows at the same time. He's isolated among his contemporaries by truth and by his art, but with this consolation in his pursuits, that they will draw all men sooner or later. For all men live by truth and stand in need of expression. In love, in art, in avarice, in politics, in labor, in games, we study to utter our painful secret. The man is only half himself. The other half is his expression. In paragraph number 3, he says, the poet is the person in whom these powers are in balance. The man without impediment, who sees and handles that which others dream of, traverses the whole scale of experience, and it's representative of man in virtue of being the largest power to receive and to impart. Paragraph number 4, this is, many argue, the heart already of the entire essay, for he says it. The universe has 3 children, born at one time, which reappear under different names in every system of thought, whether they be called cause, operation, and effect, or more poetically, Jove, Plato, Neptune, or theologically, the Father and the Spirit and the Son, but which we will call, respectively, here, we will call the knower, the doer, and the sayer. These stand respectively for the love of truth, for the love of good, and for the love of beauty. The good, the true, and the beautiful. These 3 are equal. Each is that which he is, essentially, so that he cannot be surmounted or analyzed, and each of these 3 has the power of the others latent in him and his own patent. So in other words, the argument that he's going to make is this good, the true, the beautiful is assumed in the power of the poet, and especially, of course, the poet is the great sayer. In paragraph 5, he says as much. He is the namer. He represents beauty. Beauty, he, Emerson will say, is the center of the universe. And criticism is only interested in that first box, as we had it on the board in an earlier lecture. And then he makes the argument that will be a really debated topic. When we study our James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, we always cross this question, don't we? Are poets made, or are they born? Now let's go ahead and insert this question that is, of course, a 303 standard question for us, but let's ask it again. What's the difference, or do you see a difference, between writing a poem and being a poet? Between playing music and being a musician? Between playing basketball and being a basketball player? In other words, what's the difference between doing something and somehow allowing that activity to qualify who you are? Let's hear the way he finishes in paragraph 5. He says, "But Homer's words are as costly and admirable to Homer as Agamemnon's victories are to Agamemnon." In other words, he says the poet recognizes that the words that the poet writes are every bit as important as anything else that goes on in the world, right? Now, I think Emerson would argue by and large that poets are inspired and therefore are born. We'll continue. Paragraph number 6, he says it this way: "For poetry was all written before time was. And whenever we are so finely organized that we can penetrate into that region where the air is music, we hear those primal warblings and attempt to write them down, but we lose ever and anon a word or a verse and substitute something of our own and thus miswrite the poem. The men of more delicate ear write down these cadences more faithfully, and these transcripts, though imperfect, become the songs of the nations." We immediately think of what we've said about the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, right? "For nature is as truly beautiful as it is good, or as it is reasonable, and must as much appear as it must be done or be known. Words and deeds are quite indifferent modes of the divine energy." Again, with Emerson, it always comes back to energy. "Words are also actions, and actions are a kind of words." Paragraph number 7, he begins to talk about the difference between writing a poem and being a poet, that notion of inspiration, right? "The sign and credentials of the poet are that he announces that which no man foretold." And again, as we've said before in earlier lectures and comments on these essays, Emerson is using the standard protocol of the day and using the male pronoun he or him. When, of course, today if he were writing, he would obviously use very inclusive or gender-inclusive language, because obviously everything he's saying in male can also be female as well, just so that we point that out. "He's the true and only doctor. He knows and tells. He's the only teller of news, for he was present and privy to the appearance which he describes. He's the beholder of ideas," again, that second box, "and an utterer of the necessary and the causal." He says that modern poets care more about form than they do about content, which is why he says we have no great poets anymore. In paragraph number 8, he begins by saying it this way: "For it is not meters, not a meter-making argument that makes a poem, a thought so passionate and alive that, like the spirit of a plant or animal, it has an architecture of its own and adorns nature with a new thing. The thought and the form are equal in the order of time, but in the order of genesis, the thought is prior to the form. The poet has a new thought. He has a whole new experience to unfold. He will tell us how it was with him, and all men will be the richer in his fortune. For the experience of each new age requires a new confession, and the world seems always waiting for its poet." This is, of course, that notion that we'll get to later in this essay, that Emerson is ostensibly feeling as if he's writing to challenge the young would-be bards or poets to say, where are you guys? Where are you? We need you in our culture right now. This is an interesting idea, given, of course, that Whitman is going to be reading and hearing this, right? He says in paragraph number 8, everyone has some interest in the advent of the poet, and no one knows how much it may concern him. We know that the secret of the world is profound, but who or what shall be our interpreter we know not. A mountain ramble, a new style of face, a new person may put the key into our hands. Of course, the value of genius to us is in the veracity of its report, the truth. Talent may frolic and juggle. Genius realizes and adds. Mankind in good earnest have availed so far in understanding themselves and their work, that the foremost watchman on the peak announces his news. It is the truest word ever spoken, and the phrase will be the fittest, most musical, and the unerring voice of the world for that time. Paragraph number 9, he says it this way: all that we call sacred history attests that the birth of a poet is the principal event in chronology. In other words, there is nothing, again, more important. With what joy, he says, I begin to read a poem, which I confide in as an inspiration. And now my chains are to be broken. I shall mount above these clouds and opaque airs in which I live, opaque though they seem transparent. And from the heaven of truth, I shall see and comprehend my relations. Again, back to that veracity thing. That will reconcile me to life and renovate nature, to see trifles animated by a tendency and to know that what I am doing. Life will no more be a noise. Now I shall see men and women and know the signs by which they may be discerned from fools and satans. This day shall be better than my birthday. Then I became an animal. Now I am invited into the science of the real. I think it's fascinating that Emerson will use this term, science of the real, to talk about poetics. In other words, let me say it this way. If a work of literature moves you at all, it's because for you there's some reality to it. It's not esoteric. It's not obscure at all. We'll get to that notion here in a while. Paragraph number 10 now, to move quickly. He talks about the power of picture language. In other words, he says it, what all great teachers of creative writing will say: show, don't tell. Anybody can write a poem, for example, that will tell something, but the capacity to show, that is the key. It seems to me that's always been the key. I'm reminded of that student in 303 years ago who wanted to write for that Say No to Drugs drinking and driving contest. And when she had written her poem, I came back to her and I said, you're fundamentally telling us don't drink and drive, don't drink and drive, but can you show us something? And she said, I'll give it a shot. And she went away and came back, and the poem that she constructed, that she read in our room in front of her colleagues, and then later to win contests with it, blew everyone away. Here was no telling. Here was showing. And all we see are two cars that have been slammed into each other, mangled, and all of the people in the one car have died. They are a family. With the exception of a little 5-year-old girl, she has somehow miraculously escaped the entire crash. The young person, drinking and driving, that is the culprit and the cause of this wreck, ironically, as is often the case, is alive with a few scratches and is standing there next to this wreck. And all our poet does is simply describe what's being seen. At the end of the poem, the young child, shivering and in shock and in needing some kind of comfort, will come up to the young person and will reach for help. But she can only reach with 1.5 arms because half her arm is severed at the elbow. And again, at no point in this poem did the writer ever say it's a really stupid thing to drink and go and drive. Instead, all the poet does is describe. This is what Emerson says the great poets will do for us. They're always reminding us the power of a word picture. Paragraph number 11, that we also are going to ingest a little bit about the power of symbols. And he will say it. Nature is in fact a symbol. He says the beautiful rests on the foundations of the necessary. And he says we stand before the secret of the world because of the great symbols. Everything stands for something else. I'm sometimes asked this in class. Dude, why does everything have to have a second meaning? And Emerson will say, only the great poets understand the power of the second and even the tertiary and even more meanings. Of course, we've already pointed out that Ruthie's tree is far more than just Ruthie's tree, that tree standing out there. There's so much that can be understood if one can appreciate the symbols. Paragraph number 12, he will continue. The universe is the externation of the soul. Wherever the life is, what that bursts into appearance around it, our science is sensual and therefore superficial. The point being here, all science can tell us about is that first box, over-related to the five senses, right? The earth and the heavenly bodies, physics and chemistry, we sensually treat as if they were self-existent, right? But they are the retinue of that being we have. And in other words, the point that he's making here is that poetry is somehow greater than science because poetry goes beneath the science. Now, of course, we can always have this debate. How are you using the word poetry and how are you using the word science? Any of us that love science, and I hope that's all of us, will often point out that reading Newton is like reading fine poetry. Right? We'll have more to say about that at a later time, I hope. Paragraph 13, the way he says it here is a beauty not explicable is dearer than a beauty which we can see to the end of. It is the nature, the symbol nature, certifying the supernatural body overflowed by life, which he worships with coarse but sincere rites. In other words, we're always looking to understand the power. A simple way to say this is the appreciation of the energy that is all things. That, of course, is going to be Emerson's point, and he says poets somehow understand that in profound ways. Paragraph 14, he talks about the power of emblems and the ways in which he says the people fancy that they hate poetry, but they are all poets and mystics, because he says all you got to do is just look at the ways that we love our emblems. So, for example, any sports team will always be focused on that emblem. Think about all of our politicians. He talks about the politicians who love their emblems. In other words, it's often the case that students will say, dude, I hate poetry, and yet I'll point out, well, then why is it the first thing that you like to do